So one very important thing in dealing with climate change is how we pay for transportation. And so tonight we have Reema Griffith, who's executive director of the Washington State Transportation Commission. And she's going to talk to us about a study that was done on a road usage charge, which is a possible replacement for the gas tax. So I will just simply turn this over to Reema.
Well, thank you. And I'm very happy to be here tonight virtually. I wish we could be in person. But I am going to quickly share my screen because I'm not good at multitasking and get that pulled up. Hopefully you all can see that.
Looks good to me.
Okay, great. So just RV had suggested I just quickly tell you a little bit about the Transportation Commission. We are not the Department of Transportation, however, I would call us cousins, or we are related. The commission used to be essentially the board of directors of the DOT for many, many years. And then in 2005, the legislature pulled us apart essentially and put the department under the governor's office. And the commission was kept and evolved a bit in its role. And today it serves in a couple of significant roles, one being the state's tolling authority. The other is the commission serves as the author of the state's long-range 20-year transportation plan. So basically kind of setting that 50,000-foot policy plan that guides transportation investments and policies throughout the state. And not just the state-owned system, but applies to cities and counties and regions as well. The commission also is tasked with a number of special studies that the legislature wants the commission to do, and noting the commission is the only nonpartisan, non-cabinet transportation agency in state government. The 7 commissioners are appointed by the governor from across the state. 4 members come from the west side of the Cascade Mountain Range, and 3 come from the east side. And they bring a varied perspective on things. And once appointed, they really can't be removed other than for committing a crime. So they can say things and put things out there that maybe sometimes aren't politically exciting or supported, but sometimes things need to be said. And so the legislature will often task them with studies like road usage charging that are a bit contentious, and at least trusting that we're going to take an objective, scientific, fact-based approach of looking at it. So with the road usage charge, we have been looking at since 2012. There was about $3 million of state tax dollars invested in the first few years. And then in 2016 and on, we have secured federal funding under a grant program at USDOT that is encouraging states to explore a transition from the gas tax to paying by the mile. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that we have done over the last several years, and including the current work that we have underway as we continue to research and assess the potential policy implications and the fiscal implications of such a transition. So real quick, defining the problem. Well, we know right now today that taxing fuel is no longer going to be a reliable, equitable source of funding for transportation. This chart basically is kind of the problem statement that got the legislature's attention. You can see over here on this quadrant here, we're in 2020. Today's gas tax rate is at 49.4 cents. That equates, when our current state average MPG is at 20.5 miles per gallon. That equates to about a 2.4 cent per mile rate that everybody's paying today in gas taxes. When we factor in fuel efficiency and growth of fuel efficiency, as you can see, we expect very conservatively that our state's average MPG will grow to 35 miles per gallon by 2035. We think we're going to get there a lot sooner, but state forecasters are suggesting this is the transition time. And as you can see, that equates to about a 71% increase in miles per gallon, and therefore about a 42% decline in transportation revenues on a per mile basis. That's not an insignificant problem to face. It's not a small percentage. And so understanding that trying to move away from a tax structure that's been in place for decades is not going to be easy. And so we began this research in 2012 to start laying the groundwork for a transition. We know that taxing gallons has fairness and equity challenges today. While we don't think about it, we all are paying by the mile. And basically what has happened is the gas tax was originally construed and was quite fair because it was based on a simple principle of user pay and user benefit. However, today, as we watch the adoption of electric vehicles grow and hybrids expand, the gas tax has moved towards more of a some users pay and all users benefit model. RUC is returning us to that user pay model. And as you can see over here in this chart right here, it kind of highlights the equity challenge that we're facing today with the gas tax, with so many different kinds of vehicle choices on the market, depending on what you can afford to drive and perhaps what your lifestyle will allow you to drive. You could be paying as much as 4 to 6 cents a mile if your vehicle gets below that state MPG average of 20 miles per gallon. So you could be in this blue quadrant. And if you're fortunate enough to drive a vehicle that gets above average MPG in this green quadrant, you could be paying as little as 1 or 2 cents a mile for the use of the same road today under our gas tax. So while it used to be a fair contemplation when everybody drove the same kind of cars and got about the same miles per gallon, today we're seeing a big equity swing in who's paying for our infrastructure. And we also know that preserving current revenues that are coming from the gas tax would require frequent increases to the tune of about 1.7 cents per year, every year through 2040. That would just keep up with today's revenue generation and does not factor in inflation. So what that could mean is by 2040, we could be looking at a gas tax that could be almost $1 per gallon. And that assumes a more rapid adoption of high MPG and electric vehicles. But even if we take a slower transition route, we're looking at our gas tax topping off at well over 60 cents a gallon by 2040. This carries a lot of equity impacts again, as we think about who's able to purchase these newer vehicles that are more fuel efficient versus those that tend to stay in older vehicles that are not fuel efficient. This chart here captures some forecasts that Bloomberg has done over the years on trying to guess when we're going to see plug-in electric vehicles become cheaper than gas vehicles. And in 2020 was the last forecast they put out. And at that point, they suggested that we would reach the crossover point of price parity by 2022. It's just around the corner. And that's great news for EV adoption. And that will definitely be a liftoff in terms of the transition pace that we have been watching. But we also know that we need to then prepare a little bit quicker than maybe we have about how we're going to think about funding our transportation system if we really do want to graduate from the gas tax. So what is Washington and other states doing to advance road usage charging? There's a lot of research, a lot of testing going on across the country. The dark blue states, being Oregon, Utah, and Virginia, are the only 3 states in the country that currently have enacted road usage charge programs. In all 3 states, they are a voluntary program where EV drivers and plug-in electrics can voluntarily move over to paying a road usage charge instead of the flat fees. Or if they're a hybrid in Utah, they also have a choice of paying a road usage charge in lieu of gas tax. Oregon and Utah's programs are up and running. Oregon has about 1,000 drivers in their program. Utah has a little over 2,000. And Virginia is just getting underway and has yet to start enrolling drivers. The states in the green, including Washington State, are pilot states that are testing right now. And the gray states are states that are doing research, but haven't really been testing yet. In Washington State, in 2012, as I mentioned, the legislature directed the commission to begin assessing road usage charging as a suitable and sustainable long-term revenue stream that could replace the gas tax. And it's important to remember that we are looking at this as replacing the gas tax, not adding to the gas tax. Some high-level parameters along those lines. In addition to assuming that drivers would not pay both, but would only pay one or the other tax during a transitionary time, we also, as a parameter, set forth that for at least all of our analysis and the numbers you're going to see here tonight, that in order to compare the gas tax against road usage charging, our analysis used an equivalent per mile rate of 2.4 cents a mile. And we arrived at that by taking our state's gas tax rate of 49.4 cents and dividing it by that state average MPG of 20 miles per gallon to come up with that per mile rate. And lastly, one of the important priorities for this work has been that drivers ultimately would be provided a choice for how they would participate and remit their miles and pay for those miles. So it's really important to remember that we are not looking at just one way of doing this, but a number of ways that will allow drivers to have a choice in how they would participate. So how would a rec system work for Washington? We've done a lot of research and testing. And in fact, in 2018 through 2019, we conducted a year-long statewide test of Washington drivers, in which we had 2,000 drivers from around the state participate and test a rec system that was developed. We also did some cross-border testing with the city of Surrey, British Columbia, to really see how this might work in an international border crossing, as British Columbia is currently looking also at transitioning to a per mile funding structure. We had drivers from Idaho's Department of Transportation and some public officials participate on a cross-border test. And then down in Oregon, because they have a real road usage charge program, we were able to recruit about 70 of their drivers to conduct our nation's first cash transaction test, where we actually moved real money between our two states and tested an approach to reconciling cross-border interstate travel. Some of our important partners in this research all along has been the Seattle Electric Vehicle Association and Plug-in America. So looking at the pilot, we tested actually 5 different ways of collecting road usage charges. On the left here is what we call the manual or low-tech approaches that do not use GPS in the collection of those miles. One was the mileage permit. Only 1% of our drivers used or selected that option. And it's kind of like a prepaid cell phone, where in this case, drivers could select a block of miles, prepay for that, and then drive until that permit ran out. And the way we were verifying the validity of the permit was requiring drivers to, on a quarterly basis in the pilot, take a picture of their odometer and text it in every 3 months. As you can see, only 1% chose that. Was not a popular option for our 2,000 drivers, but what was popular was the odometer reading. This is more of a post-pay approach, where drivers drove, and then every quarter again in the pilot, we had them take a picture of their odometer, text it in, and then they would pay incrementally on the miles driven during that period. Just to note that if drivers did not want to take a picture using a smartphone and text it in, they could go to a participating Department of Licensing office and have them read their odometer for them. And we did have a small number of drivers actually take us up on that offer. Over here is where we start to utilize technology more and at least bring GPS in as an option. The first one here on the top was the Mile Mapper smartphone app. That was a beta app we developed with many smart students at the University of Washington. We had to cap the sign up of that at 14% because it was a beta app. We did not want to have too many drivers in that and have it not work. It did turn out to work quite well, but we did cap that. There was a lot of interest in it. And the notion here was that we wanted to see if we could use something that most people have, a smartphone, is the way to record and remit their miles, as opposed to having them take a picture or perhaps use this plug-in device down here. The other interesting feature of this app was that there was a toggle switch where the driver could turn the GPS on and off. And so that became a very important takeaway for us in terms of bridge technologies, where if a driver in the future wanted to do this odometer read approach, but also traveled out of state a lot and didn't want to pay for those miles out of state, perhaps using an app like the Mile Mapper would enable drivers to flip the GPS on when they leave the state, so they would have a certifiable way of identifying the number of miles driven out of state that would not therefore be taxable or subject to the road charge. Down here is the plug-in device. This is what the states of Utah and Oregon are currently using. You can get this plug-in device with or without GPS, and you'll see here that 37% of our drivers chose that with GPS enabled, while 19% chose it without GPS. And what this device is it plugs into your OBD2 port of your vehicle, which is located below your steering wheel column. If any of you do pay-as-you-go insurance, that's where that little similar device would be plugged in. And it basically is accessing your vehicle's telematics at that point. When you think about the percentage of folks here that did it without GPS and you combine it with the folks, the 28% that did the manual odometer read, we had nearly 50% of our participating drivers choosing to not use GPS and participating in the pilot, which was a very important takeaway in terms of public interest in having GPS utilized in this kind of system. So what we heard from drivers over the 12 months, we collected 15 million miles successfully. It was a simulation, so drivers did not pay real money, except for that small set of drivers from Oregon and a small handful of drivers from Vancouver, Washington, who drove across the border and allowed us to do a test of real money. We did 3 surveys with our drivers, one at the beginning, one at the middle, and one at the end of the pilot, so we could capture their thoughts, their concerns, what was working, what wasn't working throughout the process and the experience. We also conducted 6 focus groups around the state. Some of them were topically focused, others were geographically focused, to get some more in-depth discussions and input on the various aspects and dimensions of road usage charging. We had over 1,900 emails and phone calls, noting that 38% of those that called and emailed us were not involved in the pilot. So there was a pretty high level of interest when this was going on. Some of the top concerns and questions are really not surprising. A lot of people were concerned about privacy and data collection, fairness and equity, compliance and the cost of collecting it, how we will be able to travel between states, and is it really just operationally viable long-term? During those surveys that I mentioned on the last slide, I highlight just a couple of the results here that are pretty interesting. This top bar is the first survey they got at the very beginning of the pilot, and of course, survey 3 was at the very end. And what we learned is that 68% preferred RUC, or preferred it equally to the gas tax. And that grew from 43% at the start of the pilot, really speaking to how experience is really important in thinking about a transition to something like this. It's one thing to talk about it, but when drivers actually experienced it, they got monthly or quarterly mock invoices that showed what they would have paid if it were a real system. And basically on the invoices, it would tell them how much gas tax they paid, how many total miles they drove in state, and then what their RUC charges would be. And depending on their car's MPG, they either saw that they might owe a little money or that they might actually get a credit because they overpaid in gas taxes. And I'll explain a little bit here in a minute on how we get to those credits and debits, if you will. We asked our participants what their advice would be to elected officials as they consider next steps for a road usage charge statewide. And interestingly, 28% said move forward as soon as you can. We were a bit surprised by that. But about 33% said that it seemed reasonable to move a road charge system forward in the next 5 to 10 years, which is probably a reasonable expectation. But 61% combined supported implementing RUC at some point in the near term. We had a narrowly implement section there. You can see the 19 and 9%, where at 19% folks were saying, we'll only apply RUC if it's to vehicles that are paying no or very little gas tax, like hybrids. But only 9% said just apply it to electric vehicles. Was also a bit of a surprise for us, because we thought a lot of people would say, yeah, it's fine, but make someone else pay for it. So we were pleased to see some of these results as people came out of the pilot and had experienced it in real terms. So to the question or the concern of privacy, how can it be protected? And we know that we can protect it through system design, those options of ways in which you can participate that I just covered, and giving users choice and legal protections to go with that. Right now, today, if we were to implement a road usage charge system, the only new piece of information we would need to collect from drivers through the Department of Licensing that they don't already have is your total miles driven. We don't ask for odometer readings in our state. We used to when we did required safety checks way back in the day. Every registered vehicle had to go in for a safety check, and at that time your odometer was read and registered. We don't do that today, and so that would be a new piece of data that the state would need in order to do RUC, at least on the manual level. Now, if drivers wanted to have that GPS function, it would purely be for their own convenience. It is not needed in order to do a system like this. Lastly, to further protect privacy, we would need very strong laws with very strong punitive measures and clear laws around what data can be used, who can it be shared with, how long is it stored, when is it destroyed, and on it goes. Very similar to how we deal with tolling data today, but this would even be more detail that the legislature would need to address. And they have begun to do that and have draft laws in place right now as we think about advancing this to ensure that driver data and privacy would be protected. So how will RUC impact rural and low-income drivers? It commonly comes up that when people hear about this, they think, well, I live in a rural area, I drive a lot of miles, I have a long commute, this is going to be a bad deal for me. But what we know from all of our research, that it's what you drive, but not how far you drive, that's going to determine the impact of RUC relative to gas taxes. One thing we know based on research done by the Road Usage Charge West Consortium, and sorry, this graphic's a little blurry, but we know that rural and lower income households tend to drive lower MPG vehicles and therefore are paying disproportionately more for the roads today under the gas tax. As you can see in this chart here, that the dark green and that light green indicate areas of the state that would actually see a decrease in the amount of taxes paid for roadways, anywhere from 1 to exceeding 5% in terms of a reduction. Where you see the orange and the red, where we have higher occurrences of electric vehicles and hybrids, you would see that there would be a slight increase in taxes paid for those drivers. And I'll note that this red dot over here is actually the Hanford site, where they have a number of electric vehicles in use on their property that kind of caused that uptick. But overall, you can see most of the state's drivers would actually see a decrease in taxes paid for highways. So what that means in real terms is that we did some analysis based on car type. So as you can see here on the far left, we've got a 2007 Ford F-150 pickup truck that's not very fuel efficient at 15 miles per gallon. And you go across the spectrum, getting higher and higher MPGs, where we get to the Prius at 50 miles per gallon, and then of course the Nissan Leaf, a full plug-in electric. We've layered in our calculations the $225 flat fee that electric vehicle owners are paying today, as well as the $75 per year hybrid vehicle fee that hybrid drivers pay today. And what you can see here in this chart is that when you compare it to the gas tax in the blue bars, drivers of less fuel efficient vehicles under a road charge system will actually see a small decrease in taxes paid for roadways. Meanwhile, cars that are getting a little more fuel efficient driving, such as the Toyota Prius, would actually see an uptick of about $8 or more per month. And this is, all these calculations are based on a flat 1,000 miles per month so that we could do a comparison across the board. EV drivers would see about a $5 increase in taxes paid per month. And you'll note that that's because these RUC bars are all the same for every driver. We no longer in a road charge system are concerned about how much gas you're consuming or the type of fuel that you're using at all, because you're paying by the mile at this point. So how will RUC influence then plug-in electric vehicles and EV adoption? And what we've determined is that RUC really holds most plug-in electrics harmless, but rates can be discounted to reward PEV owners, and that would be a policy call by the legislature. But what this chart shows is kind of an evolution from the last chart where you saw those RUC and gas tax bars. Well, here we've layered on the cost of fuel into that cost. So the green sections are consistent across the board, again, assuming a flat 1,000 miles per month by vehicle type. The same vehicle types are listed here. But what you see is that Nissan Leaf and that Toyota Prius still maintain a significant cost advantage of driving those vehicles, in addition to the environmental benefits that they provide, over someone who is driving an old, inefficient pickup truck or any other vehicle that is still having to pay a lot of money just for the gas that they're purchasing, but not paying for the taxes that go towards the roadways. So as you can see, the tax portion levels out, but the cost of ownership, or at least of fueling those vehicles, varies, and those efficient vehicles maintain a significant cost advantage. So will the cost to collect RUC be worth the revenue gained? At scale, we know that RUC will have a similar cost of collection as vehicle fees, and the net revenue will outperform fuel tax over time as the fleet transitions to electric vehicles. Although more costly to collect, we know that road charge falls kind of in this middle area between these various sources of collections. And we did this just to kind of show perspective, both in state government and the private sector. We estimate that it's going to be anywhere from 4 to 16% overhead to collect a road charge. We get to 4% when we're at scale. That's an estimate. We think we can even get it lower. But 16% is kind of the worst case scenario, and that would be where we are starting up and maybe we only have EVs paying it, or a very small portion of our current statewide vehicle fleet. But as you can see, to collect currently a state vehicle registration is costing us about 8%. RUC could actually be cheaper than that. We also have some comparisons of overhead, which would be for Costco and T-Mobile, things like advertising and communications and things of that nature. And you can see that to get a member, they spend about 10% at Costco. And at T-Mobile, they're spending in excess of 30% to get their customers. Tacoma Narrows Bridge is just listed here to show, again, relative to tolling. Tolling is going to cost, or does cost, more than what we expect road usage charge to collect. And as road usage charge gets to scale, those costs will drop down. Even though it does cost more to collect RUC than the gas tax, which I'll note is at less than 1%, indexing the fuel tax is one thing that gets thrown around as an alternative. But our issue with that is that while you can index it, and over time that fuel tax line, what starts out over here, is here and then starts dropping as fuel efficiency goes. Fuel efficiency increases, that flat fuel tax rate continues to drop over time. Indexing it to inflation can help keep it at a higher level. But what we know is that even if that were a perfect fix, the problem with that is it's shifting a disproportionate burden to our low income and rural drivers, who will be the last people we anticipate to transition to electric vehicles. So you'll have a smaller portion of our driving public that will be paying that gas tax while other folks are moving over and either paying the regressive flat EV registration fee today, or they'll be moving over to a road usage charge, which is based on their road usage. So how can the system avoid double taxing drivers? Well, we're treating fuel taxes as a prepayment toward RUC, and this gets a little bit to what I was talking about earlier around when people were getting their invoices, they might have seen that they owed money, or they might actually have a credit. When you're driving today, and if you were on the road usage charge system, of course, you're going to continue to fuel up at the pump if you have a car that is consuming gas, and you're paying gas tax because it's embedded in that per gallon price. So there's no way to peel that off. So basically in the pilot, and how this would work in a real system, is that those fuel tax or gas taxes paid would be a prepayment or a credit towards your road usage charges. So if you're driving a car that's pretty fuel efficient, you're buying a lot of gas, you're paying a lot of gas tax. And to that chart earlier, if I'm paying 6 cents a mile right now for my vehicle, but under the road charge system, I'm only on the hook to pay 2.4 cents a mile, I could see a credit on my road usage charge invoice. That could come back to me as a reimbursement, or it might come back to me as a credit that I could use towards other licensing costs that I may face as a car owner. But other benefits of leaving the fuel tax in place is that it enables us to have small incremental payments. So you're paying your gas tax every time you fill up. That's going towards your road charges, which really lowers your road charge bill that you may see on a quarterly basis. It also serves as a natural backstop against tax evasion. So if people think they're going to game the road charge system, the truth is they're paying those taxes up front anyway through the gas tax. And so you don't really get a lot of gain by trying to somehow avert your road charge bill. It also ensures that Washington State can meet its legal requirements for outstanding bonds, which we do carry quite a heavy debt load in our state right now. The gas tax is highly leveraged to pay for all the construction and infrastructure investments the legislature has made over the last 15 years. And those will continue to come due over the next 30 plus years. So how will out-of-state drivers pay to use Washington's roads? Well, until there's a national system in place, if there ever is, the gas tax will continue to capture revenue from out-of-state drivers. Right now, we know that out-of-state drivers account for about 5 to 8% of the total VMT on Washington's roadways. So keeping the gas tax in place during a transitionary time ensures that those drivers can continue to fill up at our fuel stations just like they are today, and we will continue to capture those gas tax revenues from those drivers. For passenger vehicles, the most traveled jurisdiction is Oregon, which is also transitioning to a road charge. And as an interim measure, taxing public EV charging stations could be a way to capture revenue from out-of-state EVs while traveling in Washington, if lawmakers were concerned about that revenue leakage as the fleet transitions more and more. But we do continue to work on further RUC interoperability dynamics with our partner states to understand how interstate travel will be managed as we reach the 10, 15, and 20-year mark, and we anticipate a fleet of mostly all EVs, and how we will deal with reconciliation between states when the gas tax truly is no longer a viable tax to collect. So how can the state get started with the road charge? Well, we look at this transition like a dial and not a switch. The Transportation Commission in 2020 issued its final report of findings to the legislature. And in that, we contemplated starting a transition this year, which of course has not been authorized yet. So we're a little bit behind schedule already. But to start small and to start up with a road charge system that would only be available or an option for plug-in electric vehicles, fully electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, and all the vehicles in the state-owned agency vehicle fleet. We recommend that the state start small at 4% or less of the fleet so that our lessons continue to be learned. A real system will be put in place, and there'll be a lot of building and understanding that will grow from an actual system before we consider scaling up and ramping up. But we think by the late part of the decade in 26, 27, that we could do a RUC readiness assessment and see if we're ready for a modest expansion to high MPG gas-powered vehicles. But we think by 2030, we could be ready to extend RUC to at least all the new passenger vehicles coming into the fleet, if not considering also pulling in the older vehicles in the fleet as well. Down here are just some major milestones to keep in mind as we think about this transition. Right here, a bar, it shows price parity between plug-in electric vehicles, as mentioned earlier, is happening in this decade. This is the range 2030 to 2049, where the state gas tax could be reduced or repealed. Meanwhile, we have a large chunk of highway bonds that are out there to be repaid. In 2025 is when the state's clean vehicle incentive program sunsets under current law. And lastly, in 2023 is when the commission will be completing its current research on RUC equity impacts so that the legislature could consider how the system could impact low-income drivers in particular. This last session in 2021, Substitute Senate Bill 5444 was introduced and made it to the Senate floor, but did not get out of the Senate. And in this bill, the bill basically introduced an idea that by July of 25, there would be a voluntary early adoption road usage charge program that would allow EV owners and plug-in hybrids to opt in early to avoid paying that $225 flat fee, which, by the way, is the highest flat fee in the nation on electric vehicles. In July of 26, that flat fee of $225 would be repealed and would be fully replaced with a road charge program and an introductory rate of 2 cents per mile. So keeping in mind 2.4 cents per mile is what is needed to be equivalent to what the gas tax is collecting today. This legislation would have provided that introductory discount for EV drivers to start the program. Revenues generated from this program would have been deposited in the motor vehicle fund to pay for roadway preservation and maintenance. And the bill did provide language extensively to protect privacy and driver data and exempt road usage charge data from any public disclosure. And this chart below just plots what I just read, noting that these bars in the background are the anticipated or forecasted transition to electric vehicles. So what work remains for Washington State as we get ready? We are continuing to do a lot of research that is federally funded. For one, we're looking at being able to create a more dynamic framework to model the effects of electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles in the future, rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft, and just a growing force of teleworking when we think about road usage charging and its real viability and sustainability to provide that funding for transportation long-term. We're doing an in-depth equity analysis to identify and measure potential disparate impacts of RUC to communities of color, low-income households, and vulnerable and displaced populations. We're updating our mileage reporting methods. Technology is always changing. We don't know what we don't know yet, so we continue to monitor the latest approaches to potential mileage reported in Washington State, including the use of in-vehicle telematics, improved smartphone apps, and also trying to use the retail market perhaps as a way to make payments for your road usage charges. We're working with our partner states to identify ways to reduce the cost of collection. That'll be an important piece of work as Congress also is beginning to consider a national road charge system. How states will be able to drive those costs down will be an important thing, not just for states, but for our nation. We're looking at developing a detailed phase-in plan, taking into account of the findings of the research that I just covered. We'll be doing some small-scale testing of some of the reporting methods, equity policies, and cost reduction techniques that emerge from our research that's underway right now. And we will lastly provide a detailed roadmap that will show how Washington and other states can right-size a REP policy in a system to fit their circumstance. And this will be of particular use for USDOT and Congress as they think about a national scaled system. This is the website where you can go to learn more information about all of our research. We have a lot of information posted there. We have the full final report posted, among many other things, including every handout and presentation given to our Road Usage Charge Steering Committee over the last number of years, who continues to meet and just met in July. So you can learn a lot more on that website if you're interested. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much.
It's a lot.
There isn't a raised hand given. It's not, I don't have that option.
It's a lot to take in, but we try hard to make it easy to understand, even though it is a lot to digest.
Right there,
Okay, well, we've got some hands up. So, Reema, do you want me to call on people?
Well, no, it's
Sure.
not. It doesn't show a hand up, Edith.
Well, okay, I'm going to call on, I'm sorry, I didn't see who went up first, so I'm just going to start with Jeff.
Yeah, hi, Reema. Thanks for being here and giving us this introduction to this topic. And I imagine we'll probably have a lot of conversations afterwards. And I have like 3 or 4 questions on top of my head that I probably want to ask. But I'll start out with maybe a more difficult one that we can go into the details a little bit more. Is one of the nice things about the gas tax is it really it charges against the use that you have right now, whereas a road usage charge now doesn't have any type of use that's associated with it. And that's true for electric or, for gasoline vehicles, So I drive an IV and it's a really lightweight IV. The weight of the IV is 3,000 pounds. But we have a lot of EVs out there which are 4,000 pounds plus. And it seems like if the idea is that a road usage charge is meant to deal with maintenance of the roads, it really should be that the higher weight vehicles, which really cause a lot of the road damage, should be paying a higher proportion. And so that's maybe a question is that something that has been looked at, is actually looking at a vehicle weight classification and tying a road usage charge to the vehicle weight?
Yeah, so it has been looked at to a degree, and I will say that it totally makes sense that weight would be a factor. However, at least on our state highways, which is what this funding would go towards, our highways are engineered to carry the weight of vehicles well in excess of 10,000 pounds. So we have to engineer for the heavy trucks, the heavy delivery vehicles. So roads are built, and that's why they cost so much to build, or at least part of the reason. So we have to make them engineered to an ability to carry that weight. So while an EV, a particular EV might weigh more than a certain passenger vehicle is true, the impact to the road, the measurable impact is minuscule at best. So you get into a fairness issue around trying to use that as a mechanism to determine your per mile rate. Now, having said that, there are legislators who we've been working with and talking through this issue. It's certainly something they could add as a dimension to the rate setting structure they set forth. And that is quite possible that they will create weight categories and vary the rate. It will be a bit difficult, we think, to defend because of the fact that the road impact of any passenger vehicle under 10,000 pounds is pretty much kept in check because of the fact that the roads are engineered to handle much heavier vehicles. So you cannot really show a measurable impact between an EV and a small gas-powered vehicle because of that fact. It doesn't mean the policy won't go forward in a manner that has a weight factor added to it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, I will go to, let's see, Alan.
Hello.
Hi.
So I have a question. Holly asked something similar in the chat, although mine's maybe more. Anyway, so you've made some really good arguments about why we need road usage charge, and from a simplicity point of view, just paying gas tax or road usage charge makes sense. But here is a very strong argument why that's not a good idea. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the fuel that you burn is the problem. And eliminating the gas tax means that you're losing that lever.
Well, again, the beauty of the pricing around a road charge, policymakers, kind of like weight, could set the price or the per mile rate based on emissions, based on vehicle age, is another factor. And so if you can imagine if they set a base rate of 2.4 cents a mile, you know, being the average MPG, what an average car is paying today in gas taxes, they could very easily say that vehicles that are of a certain age and thus are deemed to largely be less fuel efficient might have to pay 3 cents a mile. Meanwhile, electric vehicles and what the legislation did that was introduced actually put EVs below that 2.4 and set their rate at 2 cents a mile. So you create an incentive system within the pricing structure of the road usage charge system that then starts to further accelerate, we hope, this transition away from fossil fuel burning vehicles.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. And when your question's been answered, can you take your hand down in the reactions button? I always forget to do that, but it just helps. So Robin.
So I had a question, which is, so cities and counties are obviously paying for their roads as well. And I'm fuzzy enough on it that I don't even know whether we participate in gas tax. But are you designing into your system a way that counties and cities and towns and so forth can participate in this system and choose to collect revenue on their roads?
I would say yes, long-term, that is the plan. Right now, the way the gas tax is collected at the state level, the legislature does provide in statute some direct distributions from the gas tax to the tune of a few cents to cities, you know, a couple cents per gallon goes to counties. The commission has recommended that they not make any changes in those revenue allocations until road usage charging was fully at scale. When it's fully at scale and we've transitioned, they will need to presumably, hopefully, keep those distributions in place at a minimum. But we think that we will be able to allow for kind of like local option taxes are in place today that the state has for transportation for cities and counties, that road usage charging could easily be extended as a city or a county feature where, for example, let's say King County said, you know, we want to enact a road usage charge, and on top of the state flat rate of 2.4 cents, the King County rate will be an additional half a cent, for example, or a penny per mile. The state could collect that and remit it back to the county. So there is definitely the ability to kind of snap on these jurisdictional taxations if the jurisdictions choose to do that.
And would these be for cars that are registered to the jurisdiction or cars that are driving in the jurisdiction?
Well, that's a good question. Presumably it would be registered at a minimum, right? We would be able to know what your zip code and address is. Having said that, if one were to use a GPS enabled device as part of their road usage charging, that opens up a whole new contemplation of how infrastructure could be paid for long term. So let's just say 30 years from now, and my kids are now my age, and they have a very different viewpoint on privacy and technology, and very different viewpoint than mine and probably my generation. If this GPS thing was secure and people were comfortable with it and it became ubiquitous, you certainly now would have state data that the state has never had on an anonymous level, but you would be able to understand how many miles are being driven exactly in King County or in Seattle or in Yakima County for that matter. And distributions could shift based on actual usage, which could be a good or bad thing for cities and counties, right? Because there's a lot of small cities in our rural parts of the state that are doing quite well under the gas tax distributions because they don't come close to generating what they may get in a particular revenue package when it comes to building a highway or a bridge. So that's kind of a double-edged sword there. But that's way down the road. But for now, we know that the system is amenable to having those layers put on it quite efficiently down the road.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Rich.
Do you have any hints as to why that piece of legislation you mentioned never got passed? Did that filter down to you as why that didn't happen?
Oh, the politics of this are challenging in today's political environment. There's unfortunately reasons for Democrats and Republicans to find things they don't like about it. And I think it's a shift in paradigm, really, of how we think about paying for transportation and how we think about paying for taxes in general. So we think there's a lot of work to be gained around the sense of fairness. We also think that there's a level of expectation that the road charge be perfected more than any other tax is. So basically it has to hold everybody harmless, or maybe they don't want to do it, which no tax is ever going to achieve. But largely, we did a lot of work with the environmental groups and with low income and social justice groups, where we're hearing the most concerns of, but do we really understand what the impacts are going to be to low income drivers, for example, which is part of why our research right now is really peeling the onion back on that, trying to understand how we're going to deal with a population who maybe doesn't speak English, or maybe doesn't have a smartphone, or maybe is technology averse or doesn't want to be using technology. You can go to a gas station today and put $5 and pay for gas and you're done, because that maybe is all you have. What do you do when you're driving and this meter is running? What do we do about that? So I think those are good questions. We still feel we're ready to start a small scale EV RUC program to get those EV drivers at least an option of getting off the flat fee and paying for their usage. But the politics of it is a little bit daunting, and we continue to work with those legislators to try to help them move the needle a little bit on this transition.
So was the holdup around equity, or was it
Rich?
Yeah.
more on perfection?
Largely equity.
Yeah, we have a lot of people with questions. So thank you so much for that question. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike and Edith. You have a question, Mike?
Yeah, did you, are we doing, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I'm very concerned about an item on the slide where you talked about the existing proposed bill.
Mm-hmm.
In the upper right-hand corner, it said all the revenues would go into a reserved fund to pay for highway maintenance and preservation and probably even construction, because I'm sure we're gonna bond it too. I'm concerned about that. Even under the current restrictions of our Constitution, the Supreme Court has ruled that we can use gas taxes to pay the ferries. Now, a car doesn't rack up any miles while it's on the ferries. So we need to deal with how do we pay for other things. I would suggest that we need to be sure that this also includes a substantial amount taken out of this fund to pay transit and intercity rail. That we should be funding those forms of transportation partially out of this road usage charge. I'm expecting that there are some people in the legislature who would object vociferously to that. But I think we've got to take that on and get it done.
That's a fair point, and one we hear a lot. I will say that the Transportation Commission, while is a big supporter of transit and alternative modes of transportation, including rail, they recommended that the road charge continue to be dedicated under the 18th Amendment, like the gas tax, under the guise that this is a replacement to the gas tax, which is a road fund. However, the commission also has said to the legislature, both in its 2020 report, but every year in their annual report, has been grinding the axe to the legislature of saying you must establish a new flexible multimodal transportation revenue source. And if most of you probably look old enough to remember that we used to pay a motor vehicle excise tax in our state that everybody hated, and I guess we still pay in the Sound Transit District, but it was a statewide tax that funded ferries significantly. It funded non-highway programs related to highway safety and a number of other things that the legislature decided to spend the money on. But the point was it wasn't restricted to highways. And when that got repealed in 2000, it created a massive hole in the transportation budget for ferries and for other modes of transportation, and they have never replaced it. So there are arguments to be made for the reinstitution of some form of a value-based tax on vehicles. It has a very low regressivity score on the theory that if you can afford a more expensive vehicle, you pay a little more, and if you can't, you pay less or nothing. There were certain things they could have done to make the state MVET more equitable and less impactful, like allowing for monthly payments, not assessing the tax until a year after the new vehicle was purchased, and so on, as well as lowering the actual percentage. I think it was at 2.4%. At 1% or 1.3%, we could generate more money than any other current vehicle tax or registration fee the state is collecting. It really comes down to how are you going to meet the need? And the reason the commission felt concerned about taking the gas tax or the RUC and saying, let's use it on transit too, is because now we're taking a pie, and instead of cutting it into 8 pieces, we're going to cut it into 16 pieces. So that means less money for everybody versus trying to make sure roads are made whole, and then coming over here and saying, now these transit and multimodals getting nothing essentially other than what's coming in from other vehicle registration fees. Let's try to find a much more robust, higher generating source that will pay for those needs as well. So we, rather than try to divide the pie up more and more, we'd like to see them make a new pie, so to speak.
Thank you. Thank you for that. There's probably a lot more questions and discussion on that particular topic.
I'm sure.
but we'll be in touch with you about that. So
okay, fair enough.
Move on to Holly.
Oh, hi. I wanted to thank you for
from before, or is that okay? Thank you.
No, I just wanted to thank you for coming and speaking to our group. That's fantastic.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I wanted to follow up on, Alan said I had a similar question to him about the fact that, vehicles that use more gas are contributing more to carbon in the atmosphere, which has a big impact on our state, our citizens, and so forth. And you mentioned a number of ideas about that. And I guess I was hoping that the study would explore some of those other ideas about having different RUCs for different type of vehicles to account for the carbon and how that might work and how that might play out as far as the revenue. So are you planning to explore that in the study? Have you done so? And that's my question.
I would say, have we taken a deep dive? No, we've probably scratched the surface on suggesting that there are a variety of ways they could set the pricing structure. The legislature could, if they so choose. The reason we haven't taken a deep dive, nor has the legislature really asked for it, is because, as you're probably well aware, there's a pretty robust debate going on around how to deal with carbon and taxing it in Olympia. There's various cap and trade, carbon tax, different approaches to trying to address the carbon impact and pricing that in a way that helps to incentivize drivers to make a transition. We think that is a great mechanism, and we also know that road charging is a great complement to the carbon tax or the carbon pricing approach to making sure fossil fuel is accounted for in the environmental impact it's creating. Road charging supports that agenda by making sure that as we effectively incentivize people to quit buying fossil fuel, that we don't create a massive revenue hole for the maintenance of transportation, roads and highways and ferries. So the RUC comes in as a way to relieve that pressure. And I think that long-term fight we've heard politically that we can't do carbon pricing or taxing because, that's going to raise the gas tax price so high that nobody will buy it. And then what are we going to do about transportation and funding it? So we're coming in saying, well, there's a solution. It's called road usage charging, and it can actually be priced as well in a manner that either rewards or disincentivizes certain behaviors or certain driving behaviors or vehicle types. So this combination of policy setting creates this kind of three-dimensional world that lawmakers haven't been lucky to have, but they have now. But it's a lot for them to kind of take in as they create this new paradigm of funding. We don't know that one tax should necessarily try to take care of everything, but we know road charging does complement and support carbon pricing structures. So we think together it makes for a more powerful effect on accelerating the transition. But we also know that the private sector has to step up and help us in the investment in terms of building the charging infrastructure needed to really drive consumers to buying EVs. We've got a lot of price incentives right now coming from the manufacturers, and Congress is funding those incentives, those rebates, the state's funding rebates. We're trying to bring that price down for people to be able to afford these vehicles. And then you've got the market that's dropping the prices as well. So we think as the price comes down on those vehicles and we see a significant growth in EV infrastructure, charging infrastructure, we are going to see a huge shift in acceleration that will probably pale in comparison to the effect that these taxes will have. But these taxes are going to be in place to help us make sure that we continue on that path of transition. So it's really a multitude of efforts in our view that's going to help us make that transition away from fossil fuel.
Great. Thank you for that. So Jeff and then Robin, and then we'll probably need to move on to the rest of our agenda.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to circle back to the equity question, because that was something that when I looked at the bill 5444, I didn't see anything in there that specifically spoke to equity. And a lot of what you've talked about in terms of the payment schemes are really difficult for low income people to do because it's a lump payment quarterly or even monthly. It could be a problem.
Right.
So and I was kind of wondering, why didn't should that be part of the language of the bill itself? Is that the DOT should be specifically looking at an equivalency to the current gas tax in terms of how it's collected in order to minimize the impacts on low income people?
So the bill, there was quite a big section in the bill that directed the Transportation Commission and the Department of Licensing to come back to the legislature before this program launched in 24 with an implementation plan. And one of the specific mandates was to determine the mechanisms in which equity impacts to underrepresented communities would be addressed. And as I mentioned, we're in the middle of a deep dive research effort right now on that. We're working with the communities, underrepresented communities. We're talking about all these things from how they would pay, how they would interact with the system, its financial impacts to them, noting that, again, most of them are driving fuel inefficient vehicles today and are disproportionately being impacted by the gas tax. So
yeah, but this bill is specific to electric vehicles,
right?
Right, and so it's like how would it be implemented on electric vehicles?
So that's why
and
that's why it's silent on the equity piece right now and kind of punts on it because of the fact that it is only electric vehicles, and we know that less than 1% of EV ownership, it's really hybrids where we start to see some low-income owners, that they were able to kind of focus on the EV transition first and on a parallel route, continue to figure out and understand what the ultimate impacts are going to be long-term on low income as we move into low MPG vehicles and even used hybrid market, and you start seeing lower income people coming into that.
It would be good to tie it into your charging system, but I don't know whether that's something that's too complicated to.
Yeah, I think you're right. At some point, I mean, I think over time, and the way we talk about this like a dial is nothing is going to be answered out of the gate. But if you think about a transition and you're moving up the scale from 4% 10 to 30 to 75% of our fleet, is you're moving up that scale, you're pulling in more drivers, new challenges emerge, but so does new technologies and new approaches down the road that frankly just aren't there today. So we think a lot of this smooths out over time as long as we go slow and we're deliberate about the policy and the transition.
Yeah, and I think the other, I want to say one more thing, is that all these EVs,
Jeff, I'm going to interrupt you because we need to move on, and Rob.
Okay.
Question. And
Right.
Thank you very much, Reema, and thank you, Jeff, for your insightful questions. Robin.
Yeah, so this has been really, really interesting. So thank you very much. And I also wanted to ask one last question, which might be the sort of question that can't really be answered. But I've looked at the state transportation budget, and it's really, really, really hard to understand where all the money comes from and how it gets spent and how much altogether does it cost. And I'm wondering, like, what you've been looking at, is a subset of that, which is how to replace the gas tax. And you've got a very nice figure for, exactly how many miles per, how many cents per mile that adds up to. Mm-hmm. But do you have any kind of estimate for how many cents per mile for all the money that we spend on the road system in the state?
No, we have not done that bigger calculation on other licensing fees, for example, or registration fees that drivers are paying. Just simply because it's getting back to my comment around the MVET versus other ways they're trying to raise money. Those dollars are going for non-highway purposes. So the gas tax is the one source that they have to spend on highways in the ferry system. And so we have focused our calculations under mandate to ensure that if we pull the gas tax away someday, that there is going to be this ability to replace it and actually outproduce it. And so that's where our focus has been. There's no question, though, the registration and licensing fees that we pay as vehicle owners adds up. They're growing, and depending on where you live in the state, if you're in a district that has additional taxes that have been set locally or regionally, it really does start to add up. And the commission has talked, or recommended to the legislature that they start looking at that other flexible funding pot, if you will, of all those fees and those registration costs, and think about finding a streamlined way of doing that. Now, whether it's a new form of a value-based tax on vehicles, or there aren't too many silver bullets out there. So it's like, at some point you have to decide, do taxpayers, are they willing to pay a tax that might be a little bigger but be done with it? Or is this sense of layering on all these taxes and fees on all the registration aspects of a vehicle the way to go? And it seems people are feeling a little bit taxed out. So I think that's definitely a policy discussion the legislature needs to have, but we continue to believe that there needs to be some streamlining and simplifying of the funding structures for sure.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Reema. We've kept you for probably a lot longer than.
It's fine. This is all good.
And we super appreciate it. And